All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this City of Tucson Planning and Development Services public meeting on proposed changes to the electric vehicle charging code regulations. My name is Carver Struve. I am a principal planner here with the Department of Planning and Development Services. We'll just hold on for just another minute so that everyone can join, and then we will go ahead and get started with our presentation and then opportunity for question and answer. Okay, it looks like people joining have slowed down, so let's go ahead and get started. As I just said, the purpose of this meeting is to go over some proposed EV charging.
Chair. I was like, oh yeah, Josh Butt's been here.
They're in my bag.
Yeah.
So I know that.
Please make sure that you are muted, and let's go ahead and get started. We will have an opportunity for question and answer after the presentation. So before we get into the presentation, I wanted to go over a couple of group agreements that we have as we go forward. These are just a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is when you're sharing or providing comments, please be concise on what you are commenting on. Also, please allow everyone to speak before speaking again. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be heard as part of this process. Also, please be respectful of others of different viewpoints. Stay on topic, and also please note that this meeting is being recorded. There will be plenty of time for discussion at the end of the presentation, so it's generally best for us to go through it because there's information that may be addressed from your questions as part of the presentation. So we'll start by going over the purpose of this meeting. What we're here for is to review proposed changes to the city's existing electric vehicle charging supply equipment or EVSE regulations. Through this presentation, we'll provide context on these changes within the city's existing standards, discuss and share feedback on these proposed changes, share next steps, and also provide the opportunity to complete a comment form at the end should you want to provide written comments instead of or in addition to verbal comments from the presentation. So a little bit of background is that on August 23rd, 2022, Mayor and Council approved an amendment to the city's Unified Development Code, or UDC, to ensure that new commercial development in the city of Tucson is electric vehicle ready. These regulations, which went into effect on December 1st, 2022, require all new commercial development, multifamily office, and retail development to include electric vehicle stations or outlets, as well as conduit to support future expansion of EV charging capacity. At the time of adoption, Mayor and Council asked staff, meaning PDSD, to monitor implementation of the new regulations and report back to them to ensure that the regulations are achieving the intent that was set forth during the adoption process. So I want to talk a little bit about the regulations and what they currently require to start with. Before I get into the requirements, though, I want to talk about some of the different things that I'll mention that are required in terms of different types of EV charging. There are really three larger types of charging to keep in mind. The first is conduit, as shown on the slide on the far left, or it's often called EV-capable charging. And what this is it's simply wire that is run at the time of development to the proposed site for EV charging. There's significant cost savings here because it can be installed at the time of development, and so the property owner would not have to go back and retrofit to run the wires underground since the site is already open for development. The second is EV ready, which generally means outlets. So this is going to be your conduit attached to an outlet at a parking space. So this would allow your EV plugging to to be EV plug-in to be installed so that it could just be sort of the simplest form of functional EV charging on a site. And then the third type is EV installed, and this means your EV charging stations, which are more efficient and faster than your EV-ready outlets. And those are generally what you're going to see at a lot of sort of commercial sites around the city where it's visible that there is charging in place. And so the regulations divided the charging into those three categories, and based on the land use in those categories, different requirements for charging are in place. And so specifically, they break down in terms of multifamily residential, office uses, and retail uses, including food and beverage services. And so for multifamily residential, current requirements are that 30% of spaces have some sort of EV supply equipment in place. That then breaks down to 10% of those spaces, or 10 out of 100 of the total spaces required, are required to provide EV outlets for plug-in charging. Additionally, 20% of those spaces are required to be hardwired for future retrofit of EV charging. When you get from multifamily to office, the total number of spaces goes down to 20%, and 5% of the total spaces must be outlets, and 15% must be conduit. And then retail is a little bit different because there is a requirement for 5% of spaces to be EV charging stations. There is no requirement for outlets, but 10% of those spaces are required to be hardwired for conduit. It's also worth noting that for retail uses, there is an exception that those retail uses with fewer than 50 parking spaces are exempt from the EV requirements. So if you have smaller retail use with 20 or 30 spaces, under the way that the code is structured, they would not be required to install EV charging. There are also some incentives that are worked into the ordinance. In terms of zoning, under the code, the installation of one level 3 charging station, which would commonly be referred to as a fast charger, which is a charging station that is able to provide greater efficiency and charge in less time, would count for 3 spaces toward the EV percentage on any use. And so there is this incentive, if you put in faster charging, then you would need to provide fewer stations. The thought that you would be able to charge more cars. The baseline requirements for that are level 2 charging capacity, which would be your standard charging station. Also in the code, installation of level 2 outlets and stations above the minimum counts towards reduction in total required parking spaces. And so again, that would count as a reduction of 1 space. Also, there's some language in there about accessibility. So 4%, but no less than 1 of electric vehicle charging spaces must be handicap accessible. These spaces, however, are not accessible are not ADA parking spaces. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but essentially what we're saying is that those parking spaces must be accessible as if they were ADA compliant spaces and provide EV charging, but they don't count toward the total amount. The language in there is in the code is maybe could use some adjustment just for the sake of clarity. And we're looking at that as part of this revision, but we're not looking at changing any of those standards in the proposed requirements. And so based on what Mayor and Council adopted, we conducted a review of the requirements and how their implementation is working in order to get a better idea of their effectiveness. So we collected feedback through a review of the submitted development packages that contain EV charging, as well as a survey of community members and those within the development community to determine the effectiveness. So the survey was sent to a broad range of stakeholders, including the public, the development community, and we also reached out to previous participants in the EV code amendment process. The survey results have been posted online, and I believe they're about to be dropped into the chat. So those are available for review as well. So feedback was generally organized around the categories of experience with EV supply equipment, project-specific survey responses, and also general survey results. What was people's experience in general? It's worth noting that not all respondents to the survey answered every question. So if you go to the website and look at the results, there may be, a relatively small number of responses to that, depending on the total amount of respondents to the survey. And in terms of the development plans that we looked at, there were 14 specific development plans that were reviewed. There are certainly more than 14 during that time, but a lot of them didn't meet the threshold, especially with the 50 space exemption that I mentioned earlier. So when we get into the survey, there was definitely feedback, and broadly speaking, respondents were generally felt that the code was working. We received positive feedback on the benefits to the overall climate policy within the city. The idea that EV charging is an amenity to customers that could be provided. And then we also received further feedback that residential EV charging, which is not part of this specific code package that we're reviewing today, but it's just worth noting, generally was popular, and we received positive feedback on that. However, we did receive some other feedback in terms of identifying situations where we needed to balance competing goals, including the cost of the installation of infrastructure versus community benefit, and also the need to provide flexibility in the application of standards, especially with relation to parking reductions and site expansions. And I'll get into that a little bit more here. One of the issues that came up as the ordinance was being implemented was site expansions. And one example is the expansion of the Loft Cinema. As you may or may not be aware, the Loft is in the process of building a 5,300 square foot structure to connect their two existing buildings. As part of this expansion, there's no increase in the number of parking spaces proposed. The site already exceeds the minimum site parking requirements in place. However, because of the level of expansion and investment in the site that's taking place and the way that the ordinance is structured, it triggers an EV compliance requirement, although no new parking is being provided. So under the ordinance, it's requiring 8 additional EV charging stations on top of the existing 4. So the intent of the code amendment initially was to add this type of infrastructure when it's most cost effective, when your parking lot is torn up, when you're putting in all of the pieces of that development as it's being developed. And the idea here, as I mentioned earlier, is to minimize retrofitting costs. However, in this case, with the way the code is currently structured, we're asking the property owner, the Loft, to retrofit the site, which is counter to the intent of what the ordinance initially was. And so it's really requiring the opposite of what our intent was initially laid out. So based on that feedback, in our experience with the survey and the review of the development plans, Mayor and Council at their September 11th, 2024 study session provided direction to staff to address the following concerns. Revise requirements for expansions to clarify that these requirements only apply to newly developed parking areas in the case of expansions and not existing parking areas. And also to work to establish a path to reduce EV requirements when less parking is provided than required by code through approved reductions. And so this was one of the other situations that we saw a couple of times when we did the reviews, was that people were reducing parking through reductions such as an individual parking plan. And so if somebody had 100 parking spaces and they reduced it to 75, because of the way the code is currently structured, they would need to provide EV charging for 100 parking spaces instead of the actual 75 that were being installed. And so we're looking at amending that so it's EV supply equipment based only on the actual number of parking spaces installed. And that way we can incentivize parking reductions where appropriate. One other note about these code reductions or these code changes and direction from mayor and council is that they also asked us to incorporate these changes into something else that is being developed, which is the Community Corridors Tool Code Package. And we're going to drop a link in, just went into the chat on this as well. And I'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, but it is another code package that does include some changes to parking requirements. And we felt that because these are changes to parking requirements, it would make sense to integrate these into that code package as well. And so what the Community Corridors tool is this is a change to zoning standards to make infill development, especially affordable or attainable housing, simpler to build along the city's underutilized corridors. These large vacant sites, these empty parking lots, those types of sites. And we're looking at removing barriers to the construction of that attainable housing, promoting transit-oriented infill development that supports climate action, in the city's climate action goals, updating the city's zoning to make it easier to permit a full spectrum of different housing types, and simplifying development of underutilized and vacant sites. At the link that was just posted into the chat, there's more information on this tool as proposed. There's actually the proposed code change document. And then there's also a link to a survey if you would like to provide additional written comments on that proposed code change. We'd like to get as much feedback as we can from the public on this. And so, as I mentioned, the idea was to integrate the proposed EV charging changes into this code package. And based on that and the direction provided by mayor and council, we're looking at these two primary changes, which is to amend existing standards to base the number of required EV supply equipment parking spaces on the total amount of parking provided after any approved reductions. I do want to clarify, this is not in every single case. This is only when reductions in parking are approved, and we're simply basing the supply equipment on the actual number of parking spaces provided. This is not a reduction in the requirement per space. And then also the second proposed amendment is to adjust the requirements for expansions to ensure that the expansion requirements only apply to additional parking that's resulting from the expansion, and we're not requiring a business owner or property owner to go back and redevelop what is already there. And so in terms of our timeline for these code amendments, we're looking at doing our stakeholder and community outreach in the month of November, and this meeting is a large part of that outreach. And then from there, we'd like to finalize our code amendment language to the Unified Development Code, hold a Planning Commission study session on December the 18th. To be clear, a Planning Commission study session is where the commission has an opportunity to review the code amendment and ask questions. It is different than a public hearing, however, where the public is invited to come in and provide their feedback. The public hearing is tentatively scheduled for the month of January. We don't have an exact date just yet. At the December 18th meeting, the Planning Commission will be asked to set the date for the public hearing. And so we're looking at that public hearing sometime in January. And then if the Planning Commission the planning commission will then take action to make a recommendation to mayor and council. And it is tentatively thought that mayor and council would consider this in the month of February of 2025. So now that's a lot of information, but at this time, we would like to open up the floor to hear your feedback on the proposed code amendment, and if you have any other additional comments. So please raise your hand. And then yes, Robert Bolachek.
Hello. I've got three categories of points that I'd like to point out about this. One is that I think the ADA rules seem to be unnecessarily complicated. One important principle is to position the charging points such that typically on a single row, they could reach 3 different parking spaces, or on a double row, 6. And so hopefully there would be some guidance there that, one of the 3 or 6 could be an ADA spot, and the other 2 would be reachable from a non-ADA spot. So you don't want the ADA spots adjacent to each other next to this, blocking a couple of non-ADA spots. But it seems like you could come up with some language so that a single charging outlet or charger could be usable by an ADA spot plus 3 or 5 other spaces. Secondly, I think the biggest flaw that I see in the current ordinance is the 50 space exemption. Everybody's going to need a place to charge. And so exempting some large number of the projects in the city, and I don't remember the numbers from our previous meeting, but it was and I wish you'd say the number. What percentage of parking lot permits in Tucson were exempted from this ordinance due to this exemption? Let's get that number down so that more employees and more customers are able to use this no matter what the business is. And, we don't create a preference for large businesses over small ones. The third thing is the issue about being able to trade off level 2 charging spaces with fast charger spaces. I want to emphasize greatly that the appropriate speed of a charging space depends on how long a car is normally going to be parked there. And I want to give an example. There was a site, Jersey Mike's, I think it was on Broadway or 22nd, where they put in slow level 2 chargers, 32 amps, adjacent to each other, so they weren't spaced out, kind of in the way of a drive-through at a fast food restaurant. Couldn't have been a worse design. If somebody's going to be at a place less than an hour, the appropriate charger is a fast charger. A 32 amp level 2 charger at a fast food restaurant is just a waste of money, in my opinion. Whereas another example is if you put a fast charger at a leisurely restaurant that you're going to spend 90 minutes at, that doesn't work either, because you don't want to have to leave your meal to go out and move the car. Many level 2 and most level 3 chargers have a idle fee where 5 minutes after you finish charging, they start charging some very high fee for not charging. And so there ought to be a way to advise and accept that if you're in a place that has a short parking span, either put in a level 3 or, rightly, there is some need for level 2s for the employees that are going to be there all day. But anyway, the ordinance needs to have some respect for the length of time a car is normally going to dwell there. Another example would be multifamily. there'd be many situations where simple 120 volt outlets, a lot of them, would be appropriate if people are going to spend the entire night there. So those are just pieces that are missing, but let's not create a situation where somebody gets to put in a relatively slow level 2 in a fast food restaurant and thinks that's somehow going to work. Thank you.
Thank you. And David Carrera.
Hi, this is David Correa. I'm with the Loft Cinema. And I wanted to start off by just saying that the Loft has been excited to be a participant in all of this. We were sort of running parallel to the city, getting our chargers installed at the time that the mayor and council had began discussing the climate action plan. Some of the unforeseen consequences for us revolved around the boots on the ground reality of putting chargers in reference to level 3 chargers. An older building like ours, we do not have the energy infrastructure to support level 3 chargers. The cost of considering that was astronomical. And so when you look at older existing businesses, putting in level 3 chargers may be completely unrealistic and not something that's financially feasible for a business to take on. I should point out as an aside, there's no subsidies for these ancillary costs. The subsidies that have been available in the past, which most likely will be going away, those are strictly for hardware. So any kind of trenching or work on your property, the property owner is going to bear the cost of that 100%. And so it's really important to understand that when people talk about the chargers and they think that there's these subsidies out there, those actually cover just the most minimal aspect of the project. There was another unforeseen consequence, which was that we had to change our billing service with TEP in order to participate in subsidies and pull them down. This shifted us from a preferred billing method to something that increased our energy costs greatly. And as a small theater, when we run film prints, we really ramp up our energy usage whenever we're showing something on film. And so we saw a real impact in increased energy cost to us as a sort of unintended consequence of being forced to change our billing with TEP in order to participate in subsidies. One other thing is that we had our chargers ripped out by vandals a little over a year after their installation, and our insurance company had told us that they had not really seen claims yet, but that they were expecting to see a flood of claims in the future because this was the type of activity that they were getting reports of a great increase in the community. The subsidies originally had covered a portion, but not 100% of the cost of installing the chargers. But the insurance did not cover 100% of the replacement. And at that time, because we are behind the idea, the concept, we doubled down and we put in better chargers with more capacity than what we had before. But I think it's important just to stress that when you're proposing some of these things, you may actually cause a business to have some sort of ancillary costs that are unseen initially, and it's really important for the city, I think, to just keep that in mind. Any kind of relief, and I think that's what we're talking about today, is greatly appreciated, and it really helps. In our case, with our expansion project, it was literally just trying to get the bathrooms that we need, because if you've been to the Loft, you know that the bathrooms are basically non-existent at this point. They're, it's pretty bad. So we were trying to take care of some emergency stuff that we needed, and that was enough to trigger these ordinances. So I think the work that's being done today to kind of further this discussion of tweaking this is really important. It'll have a really positive impact on helping businesses sort of willfully participate and get behind the spirit of the total vision without accidentally injuring them economically.
Wonderful. Thank you for your feedback. Are there any additional comments? Okay, if you would like to make additional comments, you can also do so in writing. We'll drop this link into the chat as well, and this will go to a comment form where you can provide any additional feedback you may have. Okay. Thank you all for your time. I certainly appreciate your participation in the process, and have a great rest of your day.